Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to introduce Cori Zarek from Mozilla.
Hello. Thank you so much. Thanks to the whole Legal Hacker team for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you all. I have been following your work for a while, and I am embarrassed to admit this is my first event that I've actually been able to make it to with all of you. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and there's a really strong group of hackers there, and I'm looking forward to joining up with you and getting more involved now that I have a little more time on my hands. So I am here to talk to you today about a slightly different type of legal hacking, hacking bureaucracies, using our legal ninja skills to actually get stuff done in some of the hardest places imaginable, our government systems. So I'm most recently off of about a 4-year stint at the White House where I served as Deputy Chief Technology Officer. So working on tech in the White House and in the federal government was full of opportunities for creative thinking and hacking hard systems. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the things we got done while we were there and kind of look backward into some of that. And I'll talk to you about what I'm working on now at Mozilla as well. So first, joined here by several other great people who are part of the US government and who actually did or are still doing a lot of the work that I'm going to tell you about. So, you know, to be double extra clear, I'm not taking credit for any of these things, but just want to highlight some of the great work that got done over the last several years. So let's start with open data. Many of you will know some of this, but some of you don't, so I'll just start at the beginning. In 2009, the Obama administration released a memorandum on transparency in open government. It was really the first effort to kind of stitch together all kinds of disparate open government transparency efforts that had been going on around the government for decades. And it got us organized. And one of the many things included in that directive was to get all of our about 100 departments and agencies across the US government being more proactive about opening up our government data sets. And so data.gov was born, the website which serves as the repository for the US government's open data. Data.gov actually also contains some state and local data as well. So that 2009 effort really kicked off a groundswell of support for open data in the US, and groups inside and outside of government were focused on how to identify more data sets that could be opened and working to actually clean up that data and make it more usable and useful. The US government formed an open data working group that actually got together every couple of weeks, and they still do, this group still meets, to roll up their sleeves and figure out how to unlock this data that had been trapped inside US agencies. And of course, some of our US departments and agencies have been crushing it on open data forever. We have the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, which has released weather data, which has built a billion-dollar industry on top of that. We have NASA, which has been releasing data at large scale for years and years. But some of our other agencies, including the one where I had been working at that time, the National Archives, was trying to figure out what the heck a data set was. Of course, there were smart people there who were doing that kind of work, but we weren't all talking to each other. And so that really got the government agencies and teams all throughout the government focused more on open data and how we can use it. One of the big drivers behind opening up this data was to be able to encourage innovation by industry, by groups outside of government, the private sector, to see what else could be built. If we can build $1 billion weather industry on top of government data, what else can happen? And that was great, that was all well and good, wonderful things were happening, great things were built off of that data, but what we found was even more valuable is that we ourselves in the government were the biggest users of our data. We didn't really realize that necessarily going into it, that the open data would be most used by us because our government's so giant and it's so siloed and we weren't sharing information as we could have been. So that was a great byproduct as well. One of the other great features of getting our agencies on board with opening up data on the right-hand side there, you can see, is our very open and public-facing tracker of how agencies are doing in meeting all the various requirements of the open data policies. And that was, you don't have a lot of sticks in government, you get a lot of carrots, but this was one way that we could ask our agencies to be very publicly accountable for that work that we're trying to advance. And you can see that many of them had been doing very well. This is an old screenshot, but some of them continue to struggle with some of the really hard problems that we're trying to solve and protect against when it comes to opening up data. So where does open data stand now? As you know, we had a shift in our government in the United States this past year, and so new teams came in and are deciding kind of where to bring their priorities and where to focus their energies and efforts. And I'm delighted to say that open data is something that has received incredible support, continuing support. And in fact, when the new folks came in, they basically said, "We love everything you're doing. Just keep doing it. Let's do more, and let us know what you need to help." In fact, the White House held an open data summit type event just a few weeks ago, and I heard it was incredibly successful and very well attended. So I'm glad to say that this work continues on, and so grateful for the many colleagues like James and others who are still hard at work in the federal government, keeping our data open and helping us find new data to liberate. All right, on to the next. So. Open source code is another great area that we got to work on over the last several years. Some of our US departments and agencies were already building their work in the open, notably teams like 18F at the General Services Administration, parts of the Department of Defense, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They'd been publishing their open source code and working in the open on these on their efforts for years. I mean, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is a new agency in the U.S., so they had the benefit of being able to just start that way. And these are great practices, and there's a lot to be gained from opening up the code that we are either buying or building in the United States with taxpayer dollars. And so we worked hard to put out a policy that would promote more use and reuse of the software code that the US government is either buying or itself creating. This policy and the work all around it lives on code.gov, and you can track the different projects that US agencies are working on where they have released open source software code on that site. So this project, I think we committed to launching an open source policy back in 2014, and it took a long time to figure out what that was going to look like. You can imagine the government contractors and industry groups that had their hackles raised at the thought of not being able to continually sell us the same thing over and over. And so we really worked hard to make sure that we had a lot of stakeholder engagement and buy-in before actually releasing the final policy, which came out in 2016. And then code.gov went up and is now where you can kind of track progress of the implementation. So more than 30 agencies have multiple open source projects listed on code.gov. It's going to continue to be the repository for tracking that work. It's definitely early stages and it's still a work in progress, but again, much like the open data policy, it's something that the new administration was incredibly supportive of, which we're grateful for, and the team that worked on this, that quarterbacked it, that championed it, that built it, is all still there in the government, continuing to keep this work going. So another great effort that, speaking of hacking bureaucracies, since that is kind of the theme I wanted to get up here, this was possibly one of the greatest challenges with the open source code policy, was getting our lawyers and other seniors on board with something like this, which was completely new and groundbreaking to the US government. And so that is probably why it took 2 years to get this done, and required loads and loads and loads of meetings. I have a colleague who worked with me at the White House who anytime she was working on a project and had a meeting where she knew the lawyers would try to shut it down, she would just invite me to the meeting. And so I'd get all these random calendar appointments, but quickly realized what my purpose was in these meetings was to be the secret lawyer in the room. I didn't have a lawyer job at the time. I don't have a lawyer title, deputy CTO. And so, we'd get all the reasons from the lawyers why we couldn't do a thing. And I would eventually chime in, from the back, like, well, as a fellow attorney, legally speaking, and be able to sort of hack that a bit as well. So this was an area that required quite a bit of bureaucratic hacking, but has led to some great outcomes, and I think we have a lot of believers that we brought along with us. So to shift a bit, time we spent in US government was also a really ripe time for a lot of collaboration and participation with outside organizations and groups. So the civic tech space has grown exponentially in the last several years, and we had an opportunity to work very closely with lots of civic tech colleagues on projects to benefit the American people in communities and local communities across the country, around the world. And one of my favorites is the one I posted up here, the Opportunity Project, which you can find at opportunity.census.gov. And this project paired companies and NGOs with government teams to come up with products and tools that, or expand upon existing tools and services that could use open government data to actually help benefit a community of interest. So one example is Redfin and Zillow, the very popular housing search or apartment search websites, partnered with the Department of Housing and Urban Development to start taking some of the open government data about affordable housing and lower housing that was intended for lower income Americans, and actually plug some of that data into Redfin and Zillow. So, you know, when you're searching on those sites, you ordinarily get to choose how many bedrooms and bathrooms. Do you want to be near a school? Do you want to be near, you know, whatever? And it would also then allow you to select whether you were also looking for something that met the criteria of, you know, some of our affordable housing or low-income housing options. Another project involved Zillow again, where they were mapping. They worked with the Department of Education on this one, and they were mapping access to schools that had traditionally like high-performing scores for people of color, so children of color. So being able to track, you know, if you're a Latino family and you wanted to live somewhere and take your kid to school in a place where Latinos are traditionally more high-performing than elsewhere in your city, you would know kind of where to locate in order to have that type of success. So these projects all still are going strong. There are dozens and dozens of them. New companies are offering to collaborate with government teams to enhance their existing products and develop entirely new ones as well. Opportunity.census.gov, it's being led by the Census Department, which Census Office Bureau, Census Bureau, which is part of our U.S. Department of Commerce. Great team there, doing awesome, incredible work. And that's just one example of so many civic tech projects where government colleagues got to work with just the incredible community of people like you who are out here doing work and solving hard problems where you are. Gotcha. Okay. The main thing that we did on Team CTO, the Office of the U.S. Chief Technology Officer, so Team CTO is much easier to spit out, was work on tech policy. And that can be a lot of things, and some of it was responding to the urgent emergencies or fires of the day. Some of it was advancing work that we had set out to do, and that office is still up and running. It's a little bit lighter than it was when we were there, but there are still great people there carrying the work forward. This office was just formed in the last administration, in the Obama administration. It was the first time we had a U.S. Chief Technology Officer. So we ended up having 3 different CTOs during that time, and I was lucky enough to get to work under 2 of them, where we were moving forward with incredible tech policy efforts like net neutrality and thinking about the concerns around big data and privacy and algorithmic bias and so many other things. That team was at the forefront of bringing tech into important trade issues and thinking about copyright and IP and just, you know, tech touches everything, as you all know well, and having a strong team of policy nerds who know tech well and can represent that and kind of move forward important policies was the role of our crew while we were there. So we got some really good stuff done, and not only, like I said, in responding to some, you know, major urgent issues that would come up, but in really having the space to think about what's next. So artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, machine learning, all of that were areas that our office had started to get into kind of in the last couple of years and start to make, serve the role of the convener in getting smart people together to think about what the future of this work would look like, and you know, put out some really useful reports thinking about the future of work and the economy with relation to artificial intelligence. And so there's some really good stuff still to be found. I would be happy actually to share some links, or you can just drop the titles of these reports into your favorite search engine, and all of them should pop up. So. The work of tech policy is incredibly important, and as I mentioned, the CTO's office and other teams in government are a little bit, they're in a time of transition, and some of that work is not getting done in places where it had been. So Mozilla, where I am now, is this great company focused on keeping the internet open and free and healthy, and they're very interested in supporting smart, important, helpful tech policy initiatives around the world. Mozilla started a brand new fellowship just this year that I'm helping to develop and launch around tech policy. And the goal is to basically scoop up some of these great leaders who have been doing work inside the US government, inside other governments. It's a global program. And we're giving people the space and the place to continue doing the important work they were once doing inside of government. So for example, we have a fellow who was one of the main champions of net neutrality. It came from the Federal Communications Commission. And she's now working with us to continue to push that effort and try and keep the internet open and free. We have fellows who were working on the AI machine learning future of all of that efforts from the White House who joined us to continue working on those issues. And so the goal of the fellowship is to provide sort of the space for this work to continue when governments are sometimes not in a position to keep doing the important things that we think they could be doing. The model is for fellows to join for a year. And like I said, I'm helping get this launched, and so I'll be there for the next, 9 months now, getting this thing off the ground and looking for good projects and good people to work with us. So I will kind of wind down there, but I'm happy to do a couple of questions. I don't know how we're doing on time. So if we have time and anyone has questions, I'd be happy to take a couple. So yeah, thank you so much again for having me. It's been wonderful to be here with you. I can't wait to meet so many more of you and hear about the awesome work you're doing and find ways to work together on some stuff. Thanks.
Test. So if anybody has a question, this is the mic. And then you take it.
Earlier this year, there were some alarming reports coming out in the press about the Trump administration's decision to reduce some of the government data feeds and limit access to them. And I was just wondering, just from a reality check point of view, what are the biggest threats that you perceive, and what can we as a community do to help?
I'm glad you asked that question. So it's a tricky one to unpack, but let me offer a couple thoughts here. There's definitely some validity to kind of that premise, yes, but there was also a lot of misinformation in the early weeks of the new administration with regard to open data being taken offline or removed from government websites. Some of that did happen, yes, and some of those topical areas are kind of the politically charged topics like climate science, climate data, and other things. There was another very noteworthy set of data that was removed from the U.S. Department of Agriculture's website that was the timing was unfortunate, but it was a kind of a long-planned effort that was in response to litigation. They lost and had to remove that data for other reasons. So that also legitimately did go away because of the litigation. But data.gov still has more than 190,000 data sets, right about where we were when the baton was passed, if you will. And while it's certainly an agency's prerogative if they want to change the way their data appears on their website or maybe remove it from a noteworthy or prominent location, that doesn't mean the data is still not necessarily open and public. So we have a great belt and suspenders model in the US. So in addition to your data being made available on your own agency webpage, for example, let's just say the EPA, and that data then is also cataloged on data.gov. And then as a another set of suspenders. Your data is also archived in accordance with the federal records laws that require us to manage and maintain our government information. So it's available through either your own agency or the National Archives, depending on how old it is. So the data is still there. It is not going to be disappeared necessarily, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a great role for citizens and concerned citizens and active folks to play as well. And I think, getting a lot of attention and energy around this topic with the data rescue efforts that were happening earlier in the spring, and finding other ways to capture this open data outside of government, that's fantastic. I think it's, incredibly useful to have people talking about this and paying attention to it and keeping an eye on things. That's our job now. When we're not serving in the government, we get to be the watchdogs on government and make sure that they're doing, that our folks in those positions are adhering to the law, doing what they should be doing, and calling them on that when they're not. So the data is still there. It is somewhere. Even if our friends at the EPA have decided not to prominently display it on their website, it still exists. We can still, that doesn't mean we shouldn't also, though, be a little bit concerned and raise our voices when we need to. Any other questions?
Yeah, I was just curious about citizens archiving data from the sites. I think I remember hearing about some efforts specifically around the EPA for archiving using like decentralized storage and things like that. I'm curious, what do you think about that approach? Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, it's helpful to have people working on these issues. It's challenging because you can't necessarily verify that the data is exactly what came from the government, right? Especially when you're on a third party or a non-governmental website, or if you're in a repository that isn't, where you just don't know. And so that then causes an extra layer of homework for all of us if we plan to use that data to make sure that it is indeed accurate and that it is like the legitimate data. And I don't know that I have not seen yet a great solution to sort of like verify that, and I hope that I know there are smart people working on that.
I could help you with that, actually.
Yeah. So I'm glad that they are, but yeah, that's a challenge, right? Like being able to rely on the data is the whole point. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you again for having me. I'm excited to hear from so many more of you today and tomorrow, and I look forward to rolling up my sleeves and getting to work with you. Thanks.